and on Midwinter Talks. And this is an unusual one because it's going to be two Rangers talking. And this all came about because I was sitting with Dan in his office one day talking about Longstreet and how he acted on different battlefields. And we came to the conclusion that Longstreet at Gettysburg wasn't acting any differently than he was on any other battlefield of the war. So we're going to be examining Longstreet at some of those battlefields. Dan's going to be talking about Blackburn's Ford and Second Manassas, and I'm going to tackle Chickamauga and the Wilderness. We're going to try to keep our comments short, if we can, and then open it up to discussions. So we hope, that's why we have two chairs out here. So we hope by the time we're done, you'll have some good questions for us. If you don't, Dan's going to be asking me a lot of questions. Okay? So I'd like to introduce now my partner, Dan Welch.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Before we get into it, I'd like to begin by thanking my colleague, Karlton Smith. Over the last 20 years now, since I started here as an intern, Karlton has been just a phenomenal resource, mentor and colleague, and I've learned and been shaped a lot by his historical knowledge during that time period. And despite what modern books on James Longstreet will tell you, there is no one currently out there in the field of Civil War history that knows more about this figure than our very own Karlton Smith. So thank you, Karlton, for allowing me to join you today.
Thank you.
And for those that are watching at home later on YouTube, if you're keeping count, I don't know how we did it today, but there are 25 more people in the audience than Matt Atkinson's program. So as Karlton mentioned, the genesis of this program all began about several months ago. We were in my office and we were discussing having probably one of the most in-depth historical conversations I've had in a while. And if you wonder what gets historians excited, it's these kind of conversations. And we were talking about many of the myths that are used to describe Longstreet here at Gettysburg on the first 3 days of July 1863. And we started looking at some of the adjectives that historians and those writers and veterans of the lost cause decades in the immediate post-war era of the American Civil War used to describe Longstreet here at Gettysburg. We just put together a handful of them that have been used in the last 160 plus years. That Longstreet at Gettysburg was slow, that he was late, he was disobedient, obstinate, overbearing, defensive-minded, opinionated, ambitious, stubborn, willful, closed-minded, and small-minded, just to name a few. And what we began to discuss and realize is that Longstreet's performance here at Gettysburg is not an aberration to his career. We get so hyper-fixated as Gettysburg enthusiasts and Gettysburg specialists and historians that we say, oh, well, Longstreet was defiant to Lee just here at Gettysburg. Maybe he was in a bad mood on July 3rd, and that's why he could only give the head nod for Pickett's charge. No, the very real traits and leadership style of General Longstreet here at Gettysburg plays out on many of those other battlefields, as Karlton suggested. And so we're going to get started with one of the earliest engagements of the Civil War. And that is going to take place at Blackburn's Ford, just 3 days before fighting will break out at Manassas, or Bull Run, as you Yankees like to call it. So just a couple weeks before July 18th, General Longstreet he's going to be given command of a brigade of soldiers, about 1,400 men in all, and he's going to be ordered to take a position you can see along the federal line towards the mid-center of that map there, and that location is known as Blackburn's Ford. Now, if you are a commanding officer in all eras of the American Civil War, once you're assigned to a location, what's the first thing you do? You're going to send out some folks to perform a reconnaissance. What is the terrain like in your area? What are benefits that you can utilize from the terrain? What are some of the obstacles or challenges that you may have from that terrain in your area. And that's exactly what Longstreet's going to do in the coming 10 days upon his arrival to this area. Now, when he gets his 1,400 men up, one of the first places he's originally to go into position is not where you see him depicted there on the map, but just above that kind of explosion-looking graphic on the northern side of the stream known as Bull Run. And not only is he ordered to take that position north of Bull Run, he is ordered to dig in, to build trenches, to build fortifications, to clear tree cover in his front, open up his field of fire. So we often think of that Longstreet is defensive-minded. He prefers going on the defensive. Did he have that decision in the early days of July of 1861? He's ordered to take a defensive position. Now, after he does on the north side of Bull Run, his orders will change. The commanding officer on the scene will decide that it's probably not a great location and orders him to fall back and take a position on the south side of the stream itself, leaving out some pickets as an early warning sign for any advance that may come their way. And as July continues to tick by day after day, after Longstreet's arrival and him going into position, they know, the Confederates in the area know that Irvin McDowell's Union Army is in fact moving towards this location in northern Virginia. Now, on the late morning of July 18th, Union soldiers under the command of Israel B. Richardson is going to make their way down towards Blackburn's Ford. And as they do so, they're going to encounter a number of those pickets that Longstreet had left out on the north side of the ford. And some skirmishing is going to break out. And as those skirmishers are falling back to cross the ford, Longstreet is going to order up to the southern side of Blackburn's Ford a very heavy line of skirmishers. Longstreet believes that a heavy line of skirmishers will be able to stop Israel Richardson's force if they are to continue to push forward and attack the ford itself. And that's exactly what happens. Richardson's men are going to arrive. They are going to be greeted by heavy skirmish fire from Longstreet's skirmishers on the south side of the ford, and they are going to be repulsed. But Richardson's men are not going to give up. They are going to order a second attack. They need to get across this ford, these Federal soldiers in their orders for the day. So they're going to order a second Federal attack. And during this attack, once again, the Union soldiers will be driven back. Does Longstreet remain on the defensive? No. He goes on the offensive. He orders a number of his men with him to cross to the northern side of the stream and re-engage those Union soldiers as they're pulling back from their failed second effort against Longstreet's position. Now, Richardson's men are not done. That day, a third Federal attack is going to make its way towards Blackburn's Ford. Longstreet's going to pull those men from the north bank back as that attack pushes forward. And once again, Longstreet will engage with these Union soldiers around the ford proper. Now, after three separate attacks, Longstreet realizes he needs some help. And he's going to call on the brigade of soldiers commanded by Jubal Early. And you can see Early's name with where that red circle is towards the bottom right of the map. And Early's men are going to begin to bring up reserves to help support Longstreet's line after he has beaten off not one, not two, but three individual Federal assaults. Now, following Longstreet's call for help, the Federal soldiers are going to attack yet again. And during this fourth and final assault, Longstreet once again defeats it. But does he remain on the defensive? No. Longstreet orders his men to cross Blackburn's Ford and engage on the attack once again. Now, as Longstreet's entire brigade is moving across the ford, the attack is very quickly becoming disorganized. You can imagine trying to get all of those guys down this bank, into the water, up the opposite bank, and into formation. And so Longstreet is going to essentially call it off midstream. But he has demonstrated that he is not being defensive-minded. He's being very offensive-minded. Now, as we make our way through some of these battles today, I'm not going to give you every historian's perspective on the performance of Longstreet at these engagements. I'm not going to give you every historian or contemporary of Longstreet's criticisms, but I'm going to share a few with you. And one comes from a biography that focuses on Longstreet as not only the soldier, but the politician. It was released in 1952 by historians Donald Sanger and Thomas Hay. And this is what they had to write about the action at Blackburn's Ford on July 18th. They said, quote, "Longstreet ran great risk in attempting to cross raw troops under fire and build up a firing line on the north bank of Bull Run. That the engagement did not turn out badly may be attributed to good luck rather to any skill on his part." Now, Sanger and Hay will later go on and argue that not Stonewall Jackson, that's another guy in another day's talk, that James Longstreet is too defensive-minded. And because James Longstreet is so defensive-minded, that he is going to cost the Army of Virginia many victories, including this critical one here at Gettysburg. But you can't have it both ways. Earlier in the book, Sanger and Hay are saying, well, he should have never gone on the attack. He should have remained on the south side of Blackburn's Ford and the Bull Run. So which is it? So in quick review, let's look at some of those traits that describe Longstreet here at Gettysburg and apply them to the situation at Blackburn's Ford. Does Longstreet move slow? No. Longstreet moves with speed and he moves with alacrity. Every opportunity that Longstreet gets after those 4 individual attacks to cross Blackburn's Ford, cross the Bull Run River, and engage Union soldiers, he does. Was he late on any of those occasions? No. Was he disobedient? No. He followed all of his orders, even those that he disagreed with. Was he obstinate? A little. Was he overbearing? Could be. Was he defensive-minded? Only when ordered to do so. When he was ordered to dig in at that position. Was Longstreet opinionated? You bet. He was absolutely opinionated. Was he stubborn? Oh yeah. He was not going to let any Yankees break his line at Blackburn's Ford on July 18th. And he used that stubborn will to ensure that Israel Richardson's men that day did not get across that position. Now let's move forward 3 days later to the fighting at 1st Manassas. And we're going to be talking about not only Longstreet's brigade, which is the rightmost red square you see on the map, but another brigade that is going to figure into the story of Longstreet on July 21st, 1861. Now, on this sector of the line where you see those red rectangles, there's not a lot of action for Longstreet throughout the entirety of the day on July 21st, 1861. If you look towards the top left of your map, you can see many other rectangles. That's where all the fighting's happening. Henry Hill, Matthews Hill. But for Longstreet and his men, his front is relatively quiet during the day. Although he is ordered not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 different times to cross Blackburn's Ford and Bull Run and move back and forth all day. So by the end of the day, July 21st, he's getting a little frustrated. But between 5 and 6 p.m. on July 21st, Longstreet gets an order from General Joseph Johnston. And the order is for Longstreet, the rightmost rectangle, to join with the brigade of Millage Bonham, who's the left rectangle. Those brigades are to cross their respective fords, Longstreet at Blackburn's, Bonham at Mitchell's Fords, and begin to pursue the defeated Union Army. They're going to make their way north, and they're heading towards the top of the map, the center of the map, towards the Warrenton Turnpike. They've been ordered to cut off the Union Army's retreat to Centerville, which is located in the top right of your map. So they get these orders. Bonham's brigade is out front. They've crossed at Mitchell's Ford. They're moving down the Centerville Road, or the Centerville-Manassas Road. Longstreet's men cross at Blackburn's Ford for the 5th time that day, and they are joining up with Bonham's men, and they're pushing towards the retreating Union Army heading east down the Warrenton Turnpike. And as they're making their way there, towards the Warrenton Turnpike, eventually they're going to come to a stop. And Bonham, who is senior to Longstreet, orders Longstreet's men to file off the road to the right into a woodlot. You can see some of those woodlots depicted on that rough sketched map. While they're going into position, Union artillery opens fire on Longstreet's men and on Bonham's men. And it unnerves General Bonham, to the point that Bonham immediately suspends the advance in pursuit of these fleeing Union soldiers, and he orders not only his brigade, but he orders Longstreet's men to pack up and retreat. Let's get out of here. Now Longstreet rides over to Bonham, and he asks Bonham for permission to have some of his men charge that battery. Let's take the battery and continue the pursuit. We've got a real opportunity here to cripple Irvin McDowell's army. Bonham refused. And this is what Bonham said. He said, "We must go back, that a glorious victory might not be turned into a terrible disaster." And I'm sure, as my good colleague and friend Matt Atkinson would say, that Longstreet was slack-jawed when Bonham told him, "We're calling this pursuit off." And so Longstreet responds to him. He says, "Retreat. Hell, the Federal Army has been broken to pieces." Longstreet chooses for a moment not to immediately act on Bonham's decision. But he decides to head back off into the woods where his men are. They're not going to immediately pack up. And instead, Longstreet decides it's the perfect opportunity to get some supper. Longstreet's hungry. He hasn't eaten all day. How many of you ever gotten hangry in your life? Yeah, Longstreet's hungry. And so he's going to eat a little food. He's going to calm down a little bit. And while he's there in the woods with his men, another order comes from Confederate HQ telling him he needs to withdraw. So what does he do? Is he obstinate? Is he disobedient? No. He follows his orders and pulls his men back down to Blackburn's Ford. But in this particular situation, Longstreet's right. And there's very few that come to him to his defense following First Manassas, except someone that becomes very well known here at Gettysburg, Edward Porter Alexander. Alexander would later write this. He said, "In fact, the battle was treated as over as soon as the Federals retreated across Bull Run. It should have been considered as just the beginning, our part of it at least." So, I forgot these cool actions that I put in. Get to see them now. Government work for you. So, some of those myths here at Gettysburg about Longstreet, how did they play out at First Manassas? Was he slow? No. Again, Longstreet moved with speed and alacrity. Was he late? No. He sat in reserve all day. Was he disobedient? No. He followed all orders, including those he disagreed with. Can you imagine getting ordered to cross Blackburn's Ford 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in one day while the rest of the battle's going on off to your left and rear? Was he obstinate? A little, but as I mentioned, he's hungry. Was he defensive-minded? No. He went on the attack immediately upon receiving those orders. Opinionated? You betcha. Stubborn? Oh yeah. He was not going to let Irvin McDowell's army get away that afternoon. Small-minded? Absolutely not. Longstreet sees the whole picture on the field and an opportunity to further cripple the Federal Army. But in this instance, not allowed to do so. Now that brings us to a year later, into late August 1862. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Second Battle of Manassas, or as you, again, Yankees call it, Bull Run. Swap out some of my notes here. So we don't have time to get into the Second Manassas campaign. If you feel like you got a really good handle on the Gettysburg campaign, I suggest you all start digging into the Second Manassas campaign. I'm going to throw out perhaps one of the most controversial historical arguments today. It's that the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate Army, their closest chance of victory, the most opportune moment, the best that they did on any battlefield of the American Civil War was at Second Manassas in late August of 1862. So Longstreet's men are not going to get to the battlefield till August 29th. General Stonewall Jackson has been fighting Union General John Pope and his elements of the Army of Virginia, as well as some elements of the Army of the Potomac, on August 28th at a place known as Bronner's Farm. Those Union soldiers are going to be augmented with more reinforcements. The battle is going to continue on August 29th, and Union soldiers are going to continually be thrown against Jackson's position between an area known as Groveton and Sudley Church. Now, Longstreet, with Lee riding with him, with his command, is going to miss the fighting of August 28th. They've got some of their own problems to deal with a little further west of Jackson's position, and an engagement that will become known as the Battle of Thoroughfare Gap. But on the morning of August 29th, Longstreet's column is beginning to arrive off of Jackson's right flank. Leading the marching column is none other than the famed Texas Brigade. They are going to arrive to the area about 9 a.m., and over the next 3 hours, The rest of Longstreet's column is going to pour in, about 25,000 men altogether. Longstreet's going to supervise their placement on the battlefield, and he reports to General Lee at about noon on August 29th. And he tells Lee that his men are in position, everyone's here, we're ready to assist. What is your plan? And the plan is what you see on this map. General Lee immediately wants to order Longstreet to attack. And again, from 1st Manassas, that Warrenton Turnpike, there it is. The Confederate line is pictured on the left side of the map in the light gray, the Union line there on the dark blue. But Lee wants to order Longstreet's command to attack down the Warrenton Turnpike and to attack the Union Army's left flank and rear. Now Longstreet, like at 1st Manassas, just a little over a year earlier, 13 months earlier, Longstreet is going to tell General Lee, it's a great plan, but we've not done any reconnaissance. My men are in position, but we have no idea what is in our front, what is off our flank, and what is in our rear. Before I launch this attack, I need to know what kind of terrain I'm dealing with and what are the odds stacked against me. That doesn't seem like an unreasonable request, does it? So Longstreet gets the green light from Lee. Longstreet goes and performs this reconnaissance. And after about 1 to 2 hours, Longstreet returns to Lee. And he tells Lee, we've got a problem. The reconnaissance has reported a large amount of soldiers heading from the area of Manassas coming down upon my right flank and rear. I don't know how many of them there are. I don't know if it's infantry, artillery, if it's cavalry. I don't suggest at this point in time that we attack. And Lee gets a little frustrated. And I think Lee for a moment doubts Longstreet's reconnaissance and his scouting work. So Lee's decided, all right, I'm going to perform my own reconnaissance on foot. And as Lee and Longstreet are discussing this, as this is happening, they receive word from Jeb Stuart. And the word they get from Jeb Stuart is that there is a Federal column of infantry and artillery coming down on Longstreet's flank and rear. And as they're getting this report from Stuart, some shots ring out. And Longstreet rides back to his command, and a brief skirmish is going to open up on the far right end of the Confederate Army on the Manassas battlefield. This takes about 30 minutes or so. And as the skirmishing dies down, Longstreet reports back to Lee and tells him that he was able to get a good handle of information on that column. And it turns out that the column is not looking to attack any further. He's able to read the field, and that they are significantly outnumbered by his own, Longstreet's own force. So those enemy troops aren't going to be a problem. But while Longstreet is delivering that updated information to Lee, up rides Jeb Stuart himself. And Lee and Longstreet are going to listen to Stuart's latest intelligence report, which is that these troops are, yes, in fact, in the area, but they are not going to prove a problem. So what do we do next? So Longstreet and Stuart, both standing there, look at Robert E. Lee, who's the commanding general, and say, what are your orders? Lee doesn't have orders immediately for him. He takes a little time. He comes back a while later. We don't know the exact amount of time, but it was enough that Stuart decided to get off his horse and go take a nap. And he tells Longstreet, when Lee's ready with his orders, come wake me up. Lee comes back, and Lee decides, we're going to follow the same first plan that we had earlier today on the 29th. I want you to attack down down the Warrenton Pike into the Union Army's left and rear. Now Longstreet once again says, okay, not a problem, we can do this, but it's now about 4:30 in the afternoon. What's our biggest enemy at that point?
Daylight.
Daylight. It's not the Union Army. So Longstreet proposes something that is reacting to the on-field situation. And that is, we don't launch the full assault. We launch what's called a reconnaissance in force. I'm going to send my men on an offensive action to not only determine what's in front of me, but to create a wedge into that Union position. And then on the following morning, on August 30th, we will launch a daylight attack, a dawn attack, utilizing the spot we gained tonight as a jumping off point. Sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Longstreet and Lee and Stuart come to an agreement on that. Is Lee 100% happy that he does not get the attack he asked for on August 29th? Absolutely. Is it the right call? Historians H.J. Eckenrode and Brian Conrad, who wrote a book on Longstreet in 1936, said that the right wing of the army held off for more than a day while the left wing was being pounded by the enemy is surely one of the strangest situations in military history. That this occurred was due to Longstreet's extreme reluctance to advance. He wanted to fight a defensive action. Historian William Piston, on his book on Longstreet in 1987, said Longstreet may have been remembering Blackburn's Ford, where he had witnessed the power of the defensive. It was his prerogative as second in command to offer advice, but the decision would, of course, be Lee's alone. Lee, in this case, decided to remain on the defensive for the rest of the day. Now, on the following day, we need this map. The following day, the battle's going to resume on August 30th. Throughout the morning hours, nothing happens. Longstreet's attack doesn't go forward because there's no renewed activity on the Union side of the lines. And the day slowly begins to slip away. And the Confederate High Command, Longstreet, Jackson, Lee, Stewart, they're preparing to make a march around the right flank of the Union Army and rear once again because they think this is it. The battle's over. John Pope and his Union soldiers are not going to attack again. But later that afternoon, the battle resumes and a massive Federal assault slams into Jackson's line one more time. As the fighting is developing, as these Union soldiers are moving towards Stonewall Jackson's positions, one of the things that Longstreet had done the day before was to place his artillery, 19 guns, a portion of his artillery, on the very end of Longstreet and Jackson's position. Longstreet and Jackson's position kind of look like an L at 2nd Manassas. And he places that artillery in the crux between the two commands. And as the Union Army is charging towards Jackson's position on the 30th, Longstreet's artillery is in a perfect position to enfilade those lines with Confederate artillery fire and absolutely decimates the assault. But at the same point in time, Stonewall Jackson, for the first time in the entirety of the 2nd Manassas campaign, asks for help. And he sends word to Longstreet, he sends word to Lee, he needs help. And when those orders get to Longstreet, Longstreet realizes it's going to take too long to pack up my infantry and send them all the way across to the other end of the battlefield to support Jackson. And so Longstreet, believing that another set of orders is going to be right on the heels of Jackson's to assault, anticipates. Does that sound defensive-minded to you? He anticipates the order to attack is coming, and what does he do? He launches a massive assault with the entirety of his command, over 25,000 men, into the left and rear of the Union Army on the plains of Manassas. So, what about Longstreet at 2nd Manassas? Was he slow? No. He moves towards the battlefield with Lee, and he went at the speed and orders of Lee. So you can't accuse him of not being fast enough on the march. Once he gets there, he immediately attacks on August 30th with speed and alacrity. Was he late? No. He arrived in plenty of time to support Jackson on the 29th. He begins the attack on August 30th before Lee's orders even reach him to do so. Was he disobedient? No. He followed all his orders even though he disagreed with. Was he obstinate? Yeah, he was more opinionated on a proper course of action than obstinate. Was he overbearing? See obstinate. Was he defensive-minded? No. He ordered a reconnaissance in force. That doesn't say anything about being defensive-minded on August 29th. He attacks on August 30th. Was he opinionated? You betcha. He's opinionated through the whole war. Is he stubborn? When Longstreet feels he's right, yes, he's stubborn. And who doesn't? It's human nature. Was he small-minded? No. He saw the whole picture on the field and an opportunity to crush Pope's left flank and cut off his retreat, and he took it. I'm going to close my portion of the program before I bring my colleague Karlton up here with this quote that has really come to be firmly ensconced in the history of the Battle of 2nd Manassas. And it's from legendary Confederate historian Douglas Southall Freeman. And Freeman wrote in 1934 in Volume 2 of his 4-volume work on Robert E. Lee the following. He said, "The seeds of much of the disaster at Gettysburg were sown in that instant," talking about August 29th, when Longstreet continually pushed for a reconnaissance. Freeman continued, when Lee yielded to Longstreet and Longstreet discovered that he would. Freeman's arguing that it's at this moment on August 29th, Longstreet realized that if he bullies that old man Lee enough, that Lee will just acquiesce to whatever he wants. I now bring up my colleague Karlton, who's going to look at the battles of Chickamauga and the Wilderness.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andy. Well, without getting into a discussion of the Western concentration plan, suffice it to say that by September 1863, even Robert E. Lee realized that Braxton Bragg and his Army of Tennessee needed some help. And so Lee will finally reluctantly agreed to send 2 divisions to Bragg under the command of James Longstreet. Now, some of Longstreet's troops will arrive in time to take part in the battle on September 19th. Longstreet himself arrives at Catoosa Station, just south of Ringo, Georgia, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon of September 19th. And he is a little chagrined to find that not waiting for him is a staff officer from Bragg or a guide. Now, keep in mind, Longstreet's never been in this part of Georgia. So now, and he has to wait another 2 hours for his horses to arrive. So it's not until after about 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 19th that Longstreet and 2 of his staff members go riding north into the wilderness, literally down there, to try to find either the battle lines or Bragg's headquarters. And Longstreet finally meets up with Bragg about 11 o'clock that night. Bragg has a map and shows Longstreet the area. He describes the fighting on the 19th, where the 2 lines are relative to each other. He tells Longstreet we're going to be attacking the next morning. And oh, by the way, you're in command of the left half of the army. So Longstreet, still in the dark, is going to take a little rest after all this. As the sun starts to come up, as it's light now, he starts to go out along his line to meet the commanders and see what's going on and how he can set things up. And one of the people he's going to meet is John Bell Hood, whose division had fought the day before. And Hood lay remembered, I informed Longstreet that the feeling of officers and men was never better, that we had driven the enemy fully 1 mile the day before, and that we would rout him before sunset. This distinguished general instantly responded with that confidence which had so often contributed to his extraordinary success, that we would, of course, whip and drive him from the field. I could but explain that I was rejoiced to hear him so express himself, as he was the first general I had met since my arrival who talked of victory, which might tell you something about Bragg's Army of Tennessee. So Longstreet is looking at this situation, and he has decided that the best way to attack through these woods in what open field there is actually to launch an attack in depth. So as his units are coming up, he's going to start to stack them. Usually with 2 brigades in front of each division, 1 brigade in reserve. That way, when the opening brigades start to lose momentum, the brigades behind them are fresh and can keep pushing the attack forward. Now, some people will point out that Longstreet is always going to be lucky, and that right before he launches his attack, a Union brigade pulls out of line, leaving a gap. But someone told me a story about Napoleon one day, that Napoleon was asked to promote one of his generals to field marshal. And Napoleon's response was, yes, I know he's good, but is he lucky? And sometimes luck will play a part on the battlefield. So this is what the line kind of looks like just prior to Longstreet's assault. And you want to pay attention to the area kind of right in here with Reynolds. So this is what the Union line looks like prior to Longstreet's breakthrough. And that's what it looks like afterwards. What was the middle of the Union line is now the right flank. And Longstreet's men are continuing to push forward. But Lieutenant Colonel Mark C. Searle, Longstreet's very efficient chief of staff, seized an opportunity for Major General Stuart to launch an attack against Union troops moving across his front. So Searle goes up to Stuart, points this out to him, and says, as Longstreet's chief of staff, I'm authorized to tell you this, and you can go ahead and do it in the name of Longstreet. Where Stuart, of course, is not from the Army of Northern Virginia. It's from the Army of Tennessee. And when Bragg gave you an order, you obeyed it. And in this case, Stuart said he had orders to stay there, and he can't move from that position until he is sure the order comes direct from Longstreet. So Searle tells Stuart to get ready, and I'm going to go off and try to find Longstreet. And Searle went off and said, I was off and luckily did find him after an eager chase. Longstreet's thunderous tones need not be described, when the first words of explanation, he sent me back with orders to Stuart to fall on the reinforcing column with all his power. And now Stuart does that, because he has this order from Longstreet. But Longstreet's attack, because of the way he had organized this attack in depth, is going to drive through the right flank of the Union Army and send that in full-scale retreat back towards Chattanooga. Longstreet's men then turned and tried to take on Thomas's position, but can't break through his lines. And that gives Thomas enough time to pull out and head back towards Chattanooga as well. The day after the battle, September 21st, Major General John C. Breckinridge, former Vice President of the United States, now on the Confederate side, reportedly rode down his line of men, shouting that Longstreet is the man. Now, after this, Longstreet is good. I should give you one other footnote. General Stuart, among other things, was also a classmate of Longstreet's at West Point. So both from the class of 1842. After this, Longstreet gets into dispute with Bragg about tactics and strategy. And Longstreet said the only thing Bragg did after Chickamauga that was good was order the investment of Chattanooga. And that was about it. Bragg basically just wanted to sit where he was. Now, he is going to say he doesn't have any pontoon trains. He doesn't have enough supplies for his men. But Longstreet was thinking he should have been more aggressive immediately after the battle. And he might have trapped the Union Army in Chattanooga better than what he did. President Davis has to come down to try to straighten out this revolt among the senior officers of Bragg's army. And Bragg's going to remain in place as commander of the Army of Tennessee. But to deal with Longstreet, they decided to send him to Knoxville with very little supplies. He has no wagons for his supplies. What he does have, he's really outnumbered by Ambrose Burnside at Knoxville. But Longstreet tries to take the position anyway, is beaten back, and then he moves into East Tennessee. But so long as he's in East Tennessee, he's a threat to Union forces in Tennessee itself. In fact, even when Grant became Lieutenant General and Commanding General of the armies, he wanted to stay in Tennessee so he could personally deal with Longstreet, because he felt the next big battle of the war was going to be in East Tennessee. But Grant is going to be brought east, and eventually Lee's going to recall Longstreet from East Tennessee as well. So now they're getting set up for the spring campaign of 1864. Grant's idea was to move the Army of the Potomac through an area called the Wilderness. Beat Lee on the march and get out in a more open country so he can meet Lee out in the open. Lee anticipates the move, and he moves his troops, Ewell and A.P. Hill, into the Wilderness to stop Grant. Among other things, Lee felt all these woods would negate Grant's superior artillery. So Longstreet's at Gordonsville. He now receives orders to join Lee and the rest of the army in the area of the Wilderness. At one point, Longstreet's troops covered 32 miles in 24 hours over roads that are not very good. Keep in mind, he's down in Virginia, not in Pennsylvania. No turnpikes down there. The roads he's on are not very well maintained, especially during the war. In some cases, as men said, they had to go through the brambles and the briars. They tried to make shortcuts. When they got into an open field, the guides lost track of where the path was. So this is not an easy march. But on the second day of the battle, on May 5th, about 5 o'clock in the morning, Winfield Scott Hancock and his Second Corps of the Army of the Potomac are pushing against A.P. Hill. And they are starting to drive Hill's men back from their position. The line looks almost like it's going to break up. And everybody's wondering, where's Longstreet? Because Longstreet was supposed to be there at dawn. It's going to be a couple hours after that. But on his way up there, as they were passing Parker's store, one of the artillerymen at that point saw them. And he said, the instant the head of his column was seen, the cries resounded on every side. Here's Longstreet. The old war horse is up at last. It's all right now. And Longstreet has shortened his march, places 2 divisions on either side of the Orange Plank Road. So instead of the 2 divisions coming up in column, they're now marching side by side to cut down on the amount of time to get there. Hill's men are being driven back through the Widow Tap Farm. The only thing stopping Hancock's attack at this point is some Confederate artillery in the Tap Farm. And that's when everybody sees Longstreet. One of the artillerymen in the Tap field said, everything broke loose as General Longstreet in person rode past. Like a fine lady at a party, Longstreet was often late in his arrival at the ball, but he always made a sensation and that of delight when he got in, with the grand old First Corps sweeping behind him as his train. Now Longstreet takes a quick assessment of the situation. Some of Hancock's men are coming up on the edge of the Widow Tap field, and he decides to take his 2 columns and launch essentially another attack in depth. And here you can see it. The brigades stacked behind each other, not in a straight line of battle, but stacked behind each other. So again, when one brigade starts to lose momentum, the other one can push forward. One officer reported that in perfect orders, ranks were closed and no stragglers. These splendid troops came on, regardless of the confusion on every side, pushing their steady movement onward like a river in the confusion of troubled human waves around them. Marshal Searle, Longstreet's chief of staff, later remembered, never did his, Longstreet's, great qualities as a tenacious, fighting soldier shine forth in better light. I have always thought that in its entire splendid history, the simple act of forming line in that dense undergrowth, heavy fire, and with the Third Corps men pushing to the rear through the ranks, was perhaps its greatest performance for steadiness and inflexible courage and discipline. And the discipline is the big thing here. These men are forming a line in the wilderness. Hill's men are trying to make their way through that line as they're forming. Hancock's just on the other side, and yet these men are moving up with precision and discipline. So it shows the discipline Longstreet can instill in his men. And Longstreet does succeed in stopping Hancock's attack and starting to push it back. But Longstreet's not satisfied with that. Lee had sent his chief engineer, Major General Martin Smith, who just happened to be another graduate classmate of Longstreet's. And he was able to find a railroad embankment in the middle of the woods. So Longstreet tells, again, Marshal Searle, get some brigades together, put them down here, and head them off in the right direction. Now, the guy in charge of this is going to be William Mahone with his Virginia Brigade. And they pushed through the wilderness and slammed right in the left flank of Hancock's line, forcing Hancock back here to the Brock Road. But again, Longstreet's not satisfied. He wants to keep the attack going forward. At one point in the middle of the road, he has a conference with Joseph Kershaw, commanding McLaws' division, and he has a discussion with Brigadier General Micah Jenkins. Kershaw is going to continue the attack on his side of the road, and Jenkins will renew the attack on the north side of the road. While they're talking about it, and Longstreet also is going to want to launch another attack on Hancock's flank. He's not satisfied with just pushing Hancock back to the Brock Road. He wants to turn that whole position and drive Hancock and maybe Grant out of the wilderness and across the Rapidan River. That's what Longstreet has in the back of his mind. As they're in the middle of the road talking about this, Mahone's brigade, Mahone's brigade down here has moved up towards the Orange Plank Road. The 12th Virginia had to go around a fire near the road. So they actually ended up on the other side of the Orange Plank Road. They realized their mistake, did an about face, and started to come back. Jenkins' brigade is in the middle of the road, still in Karlton. They had brand new uniforms, which were so dark, they looked almost blue, not gray. So you've got the smoke of the battle, the woods themselves. The 12th Virginia coming back opens fire on troops they see on the other side of the road. The rest of Mahone's brigade were returned the fire at first. And then somebody yells, "Show your colors." And the color bearer of the 12th Virginia would step out in the middle of the road so everybody can see them. And Jenkins' brigade was getting ready to return all this fire. And in the middle of this, Oops, wait a minute. And in the middle of this, Kershaw is talking to Jenkins about the details of the attack. But right in the middle is Longstreet and this cavalcade of officers. Jenkins is going to get hit in the head and mortally wounded. 2 of Kershaw's staff officers are going to be killed. When Kershaw saw what Jenkins' men were going to do, he rode over in front of them and yelled out their friends. But the damage was already done. Longstreet himself is going to get hit in the back underneath the shoulder blade. The bullet would travel up and come out of his throat. Now, Longstreet himself was a big guy, 6'2", about 200 pounds. Not fat, but just a big guy. But Marcy Searle said the bullet hit him with enough force that it lifted him off the saddle. So that's a good indication the bullet came from behind and not from the top. But Longstreet eventually is taken off his horse by his staff officers. He's bleeding profusely from the throat. He's got bloody froth in his mouth. But despite that, Longstreet is telling his staff, I want to see General Field. Now, General Field was commanding the left wing of Longstreet's corps at this point. He basically took over from John Bell Hood. And Field comes up, and as Longstreet's laying there, bleeding, and his bloody froth in his mouth, he still has enough sense to tell Field exactly what he wants done. He said, the troops are ready, they've got their orders, everything's in place, just keep pushing forward, and we're going to drive Grant out of the wilderness. One officer said, though, especially in reference to Longstreet's staff, after the wounding, that I never on any occasion during the 4 years of the war saw a group of officers and gentlemen more deeply distressed. They were literally bowed down with grief. It was not alone the general they admired who had been shot down. It was rather the man they loved. So that gives you an idea of Longstreet and his staff. Longstreet is going to be taken to the rear. Lee now comes up. He's going to take charge, and he halts the attack. He believes the units are too disorganized, and he wants to make everything organized again before they launch an attack. By the time they do that, Hancock has fortified his line along the Brook Road and secured it for Grant. And that's why Grant, when he decides to leave, heads south towards Spotsylvania instead of back across the river. But General Hancock himself, had to admit to Longstreet after the war, you rolled me up like a wet blanket. And it was several hours before he could get started again. Again, Marcy Searle said that Longstreet directed me to hasten to General Lee, report what had been accomplished, and urge him to continue the movement he was engaged on. The troops being already, success would surely follow, and Grant, he firmly believed, be driven back across the Rapidan. Colonel Walter Taylor, one of Lee's staff officers after the war, said, I have always thought that had General Longstreet not been wounded, he would have rode back that wing of General Grant's army in such manner as to have forced the Federals to recross the Rapidan. A strange vitality attended us. Jackson killed in the zenith of his successful career, Longstreet wounded with the act of striking a blow which would have rivaled Jackson at Chancellorsville in its results. In each case, the fire was from our own men. A blunder, call it so. The old deacon would say that God willed it thus. Now, he talked about Longstreet here, the wilderness, and Chickamauga. And in both cases, he's arriving on the battlefield, especially at the wilderness. He's never been there before, but in both cases, he can look at the battlefield and get an immediate sense of what's going on. And he knows his men are going into, maybe he has no idea what's going to happen, but he's hoping this attack in depth is going to be enough to stop Hancock and break through at Chickamauga. And at the wilderness, it was also said as his men were lining up, Longstreet was riding down in front of them to encourage the men and give them their directions. Believe it or not, in the very first issue of Civil War Times Illustrated, April 1962, Volume 1, Number 1, there was an article by Glenn Tucker on Longstreet called, subtitled, what did I say, Scapegoat? Victor or Scapegoat? Somehow I forgot the first part of it. But in it, Glenn Tucker talked about receiving this letter from a combat general from World War II, talking about Longstreet. And what this general said was, there were two kinds of officers in the Civil War on both sides. Neither were schooled beyond the basic training at West Point. One sort never learned anything, kept making the same mistakes over and over again. The other sort had the intellectual capacity to reason, to calculate what would work and why. Such was Longstreet. His attack in depth at Chickamauga, is what he's talking about, was the perfect solution. Today, Army schools teach the attack in depth for an envelopment, which Longstreet made, and when the situation is obscure, but no one taught it to him. He figured that one himself. All right. So like I said, we hope we have some questions for us. Okay.
All right, so as Karlton said, we're going to move into the discussion portion of the program. We hope you have some questions for us. If not, we can get you all started. If you do or do not want to stay for the discussion portion of the program, feel free to head on out. And no skin off our teeth on that. We could sit here and talk about Longstreet for hours. So we understand that you may have things to do and places to go. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Any questions?
Yeah.
Right here down front. Yep.
Yeah, I was surprised to hear you say that Second Manassas was the Confederates' finest hour. I always thought, and I suspect others also thought, that title would go to Chancellorsville. So why Second Manassas over Chancellorsville? I always thought it was Lee's finest hour.
Yeah, so the question is in regards to my comment saying that, the finest moment for the Army of Northern Virginia was at Second Manassas and perhaps not another battlefield like Chancellorsville or Gettysburg. That historical opinion began with former Park Service historian and author of the only campaign study on Second Manassas, John Hennessy. And Hennessy goes into great depth arguing and defending that argument on many aspects as to why this is the Confederacy's finest moments. And he looks at it from a standpoint of the Army as a whole, and he also looks at it on individual levels. Stonewall Jackson in his wing of the Army is firing on all cylinders. Longstreet's wing of his army firing on all cylinders. There are very few mistakes being made amongst the Confederate high command in the days and weeks leading up to what would be the Battle of Second Manassas, and then on the field itself. So this is the closest chance that the Confederates have at completely destroying our Union Army on the battlefield. And a large part of that has to do with Longstreet's assault on August 30th, 1862.
Second Manassas is how the Confederate Army was supposed to operate,
Yes.
in a sense. Jackson holding down a defensive position, and Longstreet coming in to deliver the sledgehammer blow. So if Lee thought Longstreet was defensive minded, you wouldn't have him in that situation.
Question.
Yes.
It was a great talk, but it seems to me that the 4 battles you talked about, Longstreet's view was to push ahead, and he was annoyed when they weren't moving. But in Gettysburg, it seems to be the opposite, where he was like, "Oh, this is a bad idea." Can you talk a little about Gettysburg and his views there compared to his push ahead? And I'm so frustrated on the other ones.
I think one of the things we were trying to get across here with these 4 battles is Longstreet's the type, he wants to make sure everything is set before he launches an attack. He doesn't the wilderness is an exception, just because of the situation. But in all the other battles, he's making sure his men are properly prepared, they're drilled, they know what to do, regimental officers know what's going on. He likes the plan. He likes the situation. Longstreet's comment about Gettysburg was, this was not a good place for the Confederates to fight an offensive battle. And I think one of the reasons is because between the Confederates and the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, you have not only that 1 mile wide field, but it's over 2 miles long. And so to Longstreet applied too much open ground for a successful assault, especially right up the middle.
And that's why you don't see a massive attack in depth by Longstreet on July 2nd. Although he does have his brigades stacked up, the sheer size of the front that Longstreet's 2 division has to cover is not enough to get that true attack in depth. Yes, he's got a 2nd brigade coming up behind his frontline brigades, but he doesn't have the ability to throw additional brigades in behind there if Pickett's division had been up. And as Karlton was commenting on, I think the word that we've bantered about with is the word methodical. Longstreet is methodical. He's not slow. He wants to know what's in front of him. He wants to know the terrain. He wants to know the enemy. He wants to know his own position well. He wants all of his troops up. And once everything's ready and in place, there's nothing slow or methodical about Longstreet. That attack is coming. And it is a sledgehammer. You don't want to be on the receiving end.
There have been comments about Longstreet. Was Jackson a faster marcher than Longstreet? And I forget where I read this, but somebody, Lee himself, thought that Jackson did march faster than Longstreet. But when Jackson got to a battlefield, he had a lot of stragglers behind him. Where when Longstreet arrived on the field, his corps was pretty much intact, and he was ready to go into action.
Good. Next question.
Tell us how Longstreet became a general.
How did Longstreet become a general?
Yeah.
He was a major in the Paymaster Corps in the regular army before the war. He resigned his commission. He had actually accepted a commission as a lieutenant colonel in the Confederate Army. And so when Longstreet finally leaves New Mexico, He goes up through Louisiana and on up into Richmond and reports to the War Department. And somewhere in between, the governor of Alabama had asked the Confederate Secretary of War about making Longstreet a colonel and command Alabama forces. And the answer came back sort of like, sorry, but we just made Longstreet a brigadier general. So both sides are looking for people who are capable of commanding troops. Longstreet has the West Point education. He's got brevets from the Mexican War. He has led troops in combat. He's been an adjutant, so he knows all the paperwork involved in running a regiment. And so he's a good man to command a brigade. And if, I think the two armies at Manassas, each one would have outnumbered the army that General Scott had at Mexico City. So you're talking about these armies growing faster and bigger, and now you need officers. Nobody's ever commanded troops, this many troops in one place. So it's a steep learning curve for everybody at the beginning.
I think what's so important about that comment of the learning curve at the beginning is if you look at Longstreet at the beginning at Blackburn's Ford, Longstreet is not a defensive fighter. He's not a defensive officer at Blackburn's Ford. He's continually going after Israel Richardson's men as opportunity allows.
The Mexican War, Longstreet didn't fight a defensive battle in any place. Every battle he's fought in the Mexican War, Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, Chapultepec, Churubusco, those were all offensive actions.
When you were talking about Manassas, in 1862, that fine battle, did that tie into the overall scenario of the Confederate battle line at that time across the whole? From my understanding, 1862 might have been the South's best time, and it wasn't just Manassas, it was other theaters. Does that kind of tie into that, or were you just talking about that one opportunity?
In particular, just the one opportunity at 2nd Manassas, but certainly once Lee takes command in the late spring, early summer of 1862, the initial grand Confederate strategy in the Eastern Theater is get these Union armies out of Virginia. And so that's where you see Lee starting to shift forces to deal with the new Union Army that's developed in the wake of the Peninsula Campaign. That's Pope's Army of Virginia. It's going to be largely a campaign of maneuver. And as those maneuvers are happening, it's pushing the theater, Eastern Theater, the center of that theater further and further north, away from the Richmond capital and back towards D.C.
Would that have tied in a little bit with him making now maneuver out of Virginia, does that relieve the pressure on the west side, or does the Western Theater not really even paying attention to Lee and his moving up?
There are two separate campaigns not being coordinated.
Yeah.
Bragg, of course, is going to fight the battle of Perryville in Kentucky and lose that. And Lee, of course, will get a stalemate at Antietam. So that Confederate high tide, if you will, in August, September 62 is going to get rolled back at that point. And keep in mind, in the Western Theater, in April, Grant's taken Fort Donelson and Fort Henry and cracked that whole line. So the Confederates, that's something I don't think the Confederates could recuperate from.
Both sides are looking to have a unified grand strategy across multiple theaters during the conflict, and it's an incredibly hard ask. There is some very rare instances where you'll see some cooperation and grand strategy across the two theaters, but not anything in a significant way.
You have to wait for Grant to come along, and then he and Sherman are going to coordinate try to coordinate their movements as best they can.
Yes.
Thank you. You opened with an assessment of Longstreet that I think most of us have heard since growing up. And it seems to be at odds with, in terms of your presentation, the assessment of his peers at the time during the war. To what extent did that assessment arise in the wake of the war and differences over how we think about what has happened and how we go forward, the whole lost cause, and that animus that arose against Longstreet in those years?
So the question, I'm going to turn it over to Karlton here, but just so we get it for the folks at home on YouTube, the question is in regards to Longstreet's contemporaries during the war writing one way about him versus the reputation or narrative that develops about Longstreet's role in the war here at Gettysburg or other battlefields in the wake of the war and during the lost cause. And then set those opinions against what Karlton and I talked about today is basically a challenge to that historiography. So, Karlton.
Generally speaking, Longstreet's contemporaries tend to look up to him. They thought he was Lee's right-hand man. There was one report at one time in the war that the three leading generals in the South, Lee, Beauregard, and Joe Johnston, all wanted Longstreet as their second in command. So that tells you something right there. You dare hear stories that people say, well, Lee should have gotten rid of Longstreet because of Gettysburg. If Lee wanted to get rid of Longstreet, he had plenty of chances to do it. He could have kept him out in the Western Theater after they sent him out there. After his wounding, Lee could have told Longstreet, oh, don't bother to come back, just take care of your wound. But Lee couldn't wait for Longstreet to get back, especially after his wounding. Longstreet wrote to Lee and said something about that he would take a lower position if someone, he didn't put it this way, but he was implying, if you can find somebody healthier than I am to put in my place. But Lee didn't want anybody else. He wanted Longstreet. And so Longstreet came back in October of '64. And was basically placed in the defenses of Richmond. He's in charge of defending the capital itself. And his first day on the front line, when his men realized he was back, a cheer went up all along the line. So his men never forgot Longstreet, even in the post-war years. Wherever Longstreet showed up, he was given cheers after cheers by his ex-men. He gets in trouble in the post-war years because he basically is telling the South, you know, we fought this war, we gave it our best shot, and we lost. And it's up to the victors to set the terms of what's going to happen next. So Longstreet encouraged the people of the South to accept Reconstruction, work through it the best way we can. We have to accept black suffrage. And Longstreet was an outspoken advocate of black suffrage, which of course is not going to set him too right in the South. He became a Republican, accepted an appointment from his friend General Grant, and just to throw this out, Longstreet had been a long member of the Episcopal Church. And he found out even the church didn't want him. So he became a Catholic at that point. But I remember reading a story about at his funeral in 1904, right before they lowered the casket, a Confederate veteran came up and laid his uniform on Longstreet's coffin. So if you want to know what the men thought of him, that's a good example. And then historians like Douglas Southard Freeman just latched on to the lost cause myth about Longstreet being slow, being obstinate. And when you think about it, when historians say that Longstreet realized he could overbear Lee, he could force his way onto Lee, that says more about Lee than it does Longstreet. I don't know if I'd want a commanding officer who would allow himself to be berated almost by a subordinate until the subordinate got his way. That doesn't sound like the type of guy you want. And here at Gettysburg, Longstreet made a proposal to go around the flank twice. Lee rejected it. The second time with some heat. And so there are people who say, okay, Longstreet's not obeying Lee to attack at sunrise. But then when he does get in position and actually does attack, people criticize him for that. Where John Bell Hood said, let's go around the flank. And Longstreet said, no, Lee's orders are to attack, and we have to do it now. And Colonel Sanger said in his book, he said, can you imagine if Longstreet had gone to Lee a third time with the same plan that Lee's already rejected? Lee would have been well within his rights at that point to relieve Longstreet of command for insubordination. So Longstreet said, here's what Lee wants. We've got to do it. There's no more time. Just push off and do the best you can.
And one of the things that's really lost on us today is, as Lee's most trusted subordinate, especially in the wake of Jackson's death, Longstreet becomes almost the de facto second in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. He becomes Lee's right hand. He's Lee's old warhorse. It's part of Longstreet's duty to speak up against plans that are being made by Lee, to challenge them if they're wrong, or provide alternative solutions to the challenges they see on the field. That doesn't necessarily mean he's obstinate and overbearing or insubordinate. And at the case here at Gettysburg, he's presented that plan twice. Lee has said no twice, and that's the end of the story. It's why he doesn't allow Hood to go to Lee directly. Lee's given his orders. He's done it twice. That's it. He's going to follow those orders.
One thing, not to correct Dan or anything, but one thing to remember is when the Confederate Congress came out with its list of lieutenant generals, Longstreet is number one. And Jackson, I think, is 4 or 5. So by rank, Longstreet is the senior lieutenant general in the entire Confederate Army. And so that automatically made him second in command to Lee.
Yeah. We had one up there who's been waiting for a while. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. On July 2nd, Longstreet ordered a countermarch, which I think you've been criticized for. Does that play into this thing of being slow? And also, I would be interested in your opinion as to the significance of that countermarch.
So the question is in regards to Longstreet orders a countermarch on July 2nd. Does that play into the idea of Longstreet being slow? And then, can you expand a little bit, Karlton, on the march itself?
The counter march is about 5 miles altogether. So Longstreet starts at about 1:45 or so. He starts the whole march about 1:45. By 3:30 in the afternoon, his artillery is opening fire, and his infantry is moving into position. So that's 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours on a 5-mile march. And that's about what you should expect of men marching on good roads. And these are not good roads. Longstreet's got to move on. McLaws at one point said they went down one road that was so narrow they had to break files to the rear, which means they went from a column of 4s to a column of 2s to make the march. So 5 miles in 2.5 hours, that's not being slow.
Again, the purpose for that was for him to be able to move his men into position without being seen by the Union signal station on Little Round Top. Another question.
I already had one.
Some-
Oh,
Got another one.
yes, sir.
Yeah, the majority, this was Gettysburg was a disaster for the Confederates, and the majority of Confederate generals were from Virginia. So after the battle, and Longstreet from Georgia, so is there an ingredient of states issue in here with the guys from Virginia piling it on the guys from Georgia?
After the battle and after the war,
Yes.
were the guys from Virginia piling it on Longstreet? Yeah, you'd have to say that. Juba Early and William Pendleton are leading the charge on that. Pendleton or Juba Early was actually, is he the editor, president of the Southern Historical Society? And so, especially in those first few volumes of the papers, it's all pretty much anti-Longstreet, with Juba Early doing most of the writing. Juba Early, you always have to take with a bag of salt on your shoulder. I think Edwin Pennington in the Gettysburg campaign said something to the effect that sometimes, and this isn't an exact quote, but it was in reference to Early, sometimes your hindsight becomes your foresight. In other words, and keep in mind what Jubilee was writing about Gettysburg, where he's meeting with Richard Ewell, who's Ransom, not Ransom. Yeah, those guys had all died before Juba really started to write. So there was nobody around who could contradict what he was saying. And so that's why people have relied on Juba Early's account than anything else. But you have to look at other things and then look at Juba Early. Yes, sir.
Didn't Early intentionally wait to put his parade of anti-Longstreet stuff on there after Lee died because he knew Lee
of
would
course.
stand for it?
Yeah, the question is, didn't Early wait until after Lee died? They all did. Because Lee would not allow any open criticism of his officers during the war, and they knew he wasn't going to allow it after the war. So yeah, they had to wait till Lee was safely in the grave to do something.
And that's reflected contemporaneously at the Battle of Gettysburg. That's why Lee asks not Longstreet, but Pickett to rewrite his report. Lee's not going to allow criticisms of other officers in these official reports that are going to be filed with the War Department and eventually make their way into Southern newspapers.
Yes, ma'am.
It seems to me that we have an image of Longstreet at Gettysburg on day 3 of just sitting and nodding tearfully for the beginning of Pickett's charge. But there are other images of him at Gettysburg that we don't really hear about very much. On day 2, with him leading a charge with his hat, I think his wife wanted the statue of him to show him leading a charge with his hat. And also, earlier, I think, before Pickett's charge, one of his generals, it might have been Kemper, said something about watching him on his horse during the cannonade, and it was the most amazing, magnificent thing he had seen. But we don't have that image of Longstreet at Gettysburg. And I'm wondering why we don't have those images of him leading a charge or being brave. We just have this negative, supposed negative image of him nodding his head quietly. Is that because of Southern historians? Is it a failure of the Park Service interpreters? Why do we have such a negative image of him?
Well, first of all, let me respond to government's never wrong. So, We've gotten it right all along.
And it's certainly not from park historians that
Yeah.
you get that negative image of Longstreet. It's more from Southern historians. And people, until the 1980s, 1990s, people pretty much followed the Southern version of history. You know, it's often said that it's the victors who write the history. In the American Civil War, it was the losers who wrote the history. And so that's the version we had until Longstreet's rehabilitation really starts in the 1990s. So it's still going on. But you're right. Kemper wrote about Longstreet riding down the front of his line like an old farmer, surveying his fields. And we know he and Lee rode along the lines several times to make sure everything was right. Now, you might ask the question, why did it take so long between the meeting down at the peach orchard early in the morning and the firing of the cannon at 1 o'clock in the afternoon? And a former Army officer told me, I'm going to clean this up for you a little bit. He said, if you're going to mess up, do it in front of your commander. So Lee was with Longstreet most of that morning of July 3rd. And if he's not moving fast enough or anything like that, it's up to Lee to tell him to get moving faster. But apparently, according to Alexander, the artillery line on Longstreet's front wasn't set up until about 11 o'clock in the morning. And then they had to make sure the artillery line is set up along A.P. Hill's front. How much cooperation is Hill and Longstreet having? Do Pettigrew and Trimble understand their part in the attack? So all that has to be understood before the cannonade can even start. So that's why it's taking till 1 o'clock in the afternoon to get going.
Good time for maybe one or two more.
So, this business about Longstreet suggesting to Lee twice that they pull out and go around the flank and find their own high ground to threaten Washington and Baltimore. It sounds good, but realistically, to pull the entire Confederate Army out of their lines, put them in a long, extended miles-long line around the flank of the Union Army, it seems like it would expose them, miles of them, to flank attacks. The Union could have come off their positions and hit them in the flanks. It just doesn't seem like it was a realistic idea.
Well, I think you need to, there's two components to that. It's hard to argue the what-ifs because we don't know what would have happened.
Yeah.
But there are such things or situations that we refer to as tactical redeployments. And those have been used on battlefields throughout the history of warfare.
And Colonel Sang in his book
Yes.
brought that up.
Yes.
He said, was Longstreet suggesting a tactical move or a strategic move?
Yeah.
And Sang concluded from studying Longstreet's other maneuvers on other battlefields, he was suggesting a tactical move around the flank.
Yep.
But to do that on July 2nd, after the troops were in position, would mean no attack on July 2nd. Because if you move Hood around, then you have to move McLaws around. Then you've got to move Anderson down. And then you got to fill in behind him. So all that's going to take time, which Lee doesn't have on July 2nd. And so that's why they have to launch the attacks from where they are.
And that's when you start seeing the blending of the tactical versus the strategic. The tactical redeployment and the time that Karlton's talking about would affect the strategy that Lee has for the Army. And Lee likes to utilize what's known as the initiative, when he comes up with these strategic plans, and to some extent tactical level as well. And once you eat up all that time for a tactical redeployment, you would yield the initiative to, in this case, the Union Army in Meade. And that's something that Lee is unwilling to do. Lee is at his best. Every campaign, every battlefield you look at that Lee does well, Lee maintains the strategic initiative at all times. When Lee is on his heels, he does not have that initiative. So it's an uncomfortable place for Lee to operate on if he does not have that initiative.
That's one of the things Grant takes away from Lee after the Wilderness. He's not going to allow Lee to take the initiative again. And so Lee has to fight defensive battle all the way from Spotsylvania down to Petersburg.
We're going to go one more, and then, yep.
Yeah. What, did Longstreet and Lee know exactly what was going on in Culp's Hill?
Nope.
That is a mixed bag
It's
of an answer.
Lee visits over on Culp's Hill after the battle on July 1st.
Yes.
Get an assessment from Ewell, what's going on. And Lee at that point seriously considered moving Ewell's corps away from Culp's Hill and bringing it around to the right flank of the army. Ewell comes over to Lee later on and says, my guys can take the position, let me to have a crack at it. And Lee, later in the night, July 1st, says, go ahead. July 2nd, Lee is conducting a reconnaissance of the Union line, mainly down along Cemetery Ridge towards the high ground at the Round Tops. He again, though, goes over to Ewell on July 2nd, has another talk with him, and again is suggesting the idea of Ewell moving around to the right. And Ewell convinces Lee again to let him stay there. He can take the position. And Lee says, okay, if you think you can do it, go ahead. And now Lee comes back towards Seminary Ridge to get the report on the reconnaissance. At one point, he goes over to Hare's Ridge. And that's where I think he meets with McLaws. He didn't meet with McLaws on Seminary Ridge. It's back on Hare's Ridge. And after that, with Lee is hearing, keep in mind, Ewell's orders for July 2nd is you start a diversionary attack when you hear Longstreet's guns. And when somebody over on your side hears Longstreet's guns, they start a diversionary attack in favor of it, although it's coming too late in the day. Ewell does report that he received an order from Lee to renew the attack the next day. Now, it's significant to understand that Lee did not meet with any of his corps commanders on the night of July 2nd. So how Lee intends to have this concert of action, this coordination, I'm not sure how he was planning to do that without all three corps commanders right there looking over a map, finding out from each of them what's happened that day and planning the next day's moves. If he had done that, he might not have. Now keep in mind, Lee's plan on July 3rd, initially, was the same plan he had for July 2nd, which was to launch an attack all along the length of the Union line. There's going to be two exceptions on July 3rd. His troops will launch attacks from ground they gained on July 2nd, which means Longstreet can launch attacks from Devil's Den, the Wheatfield, places like that, plus Longstreet will have the addition of Pickett's First Division. Okay, those were the only two changes. And then Longstreet took it on himself to try to find a route around the Round Tops, so he didn't have to tangle with them again. And that's when Lee comes up and says, no, we're not doing it. Plus, Slocum had launched a counterattack at 4:30 in the morning against Culp's Hill. So yours men are engaged before they're supposed to be because of Union initiative. And keep in mind, that's the only counterattack the North had in all 3 days of the battle. So those things contribute to Lee's thinking that Meade's center is weak, that he's used those troops to reinforce the flanks. And so that's why he's going to send this column right up the middle, he hopes, and break through. But as we pointed out here, Gettysburg is not Chickamauga. Longstreet had the advantage of a lot of woods to cover his flanks, if nothing else.
So for the folks at home, that was in response to the question regarding does Lee or know exactly what, or does Longstreet and Lee know exactly what's going on at Culp's Hill? And before we get to our last question, if you were listening closely in there, Karlton laid out that, in fact, General Lee may have made a mistake here at Gettysburg. So before the lightning strikes, we will have our final question. Ralph?
From, Longstreet had a rough time reading what was written about him up until his death. His wife tries to rehabilitate, but it just gets worse. Freeman is the bottom. And then it rebounds. And you have Tucker and Connington being a little more balanced. And then we get up to Tom Berenger, where now he's a Marvel superstar.
Right.
Can you think of anybody in history that had that kind of arc? And where does it go next?
Boy.
So the question was really the arc of Longstreet's reputation, and how in the immediate post-war years the Lost Cause writings really damaged that reputation, and that remains pretty much entrenched till we start getting into the 1950s and 60s, and then we get Tom Berenger that makes Longstreet in the Gettysburg movie seem like, as you mentioned, a Marvel superstar. And where does it go from here? I'll start, and then I'll turn it over to Karlton to finish. I think that you're going to, for a while yet in the 21st century scholarship, continue to see a rehabilitation of Longstreet. I don't think it's complete yet. I know we've had a couple new books out on Longstreet within the last several years. Some of them tend to focus on very small portions of Longstreet's personal history as far as to events that he's involved in. Two of them are specifically here to Gettysburg. One of them heavily concentrates on his post-war period, particularly in Louisiana and the Grant administration. But I don't think yet, and Karlton may disagree with me, I don't think we're done with that rehabilitation. I've yet to see a book out recently or one coming out in the near future that rehabilitates the entirety of the reputation, not just Gettysburg.
You were talking about one general that might have a similar arc to Longstreet. One that's sprung to mind was his good friend Ulysses S. Grant. I mean, we know Grant, unconditional surrender Grant, Vicksburg campaign, but then there's also Grant the Butcher. Grant, who doesn't care about losing men, he just throws them into combat all the time. And now we know that Grant's casualty figures, percentage-wise, were lower than Lee's. I think Grant's percentage was about 17%, Lee's was over 21%. So you have to question who's, and then recently Grant's reputation keeps getting bounced back and forth. And now, by some, he is seen as this great general of the war, who, by coordinating all the armies that nobody had done before, was able to defeat the Confederates. And keep in mind, Grant comes east in March of 1864. Or excuse me, it's actually, you want to start the Overland Campaign in May of 64. April 65, the war is over in less than a year. And that's what Grant's assignment was in the war. And that's what he does. And then you have his reputation as president, which isn't very good. But again, it's a situation where Grant's men, just like Longstreet, were kind of always there for him. When he was at reunions, they would give him standing ovations. Mark Twain said he was at a reunion one day, Grant was on the stand, everybody was clapping and cheering. He said Grant was just sitting there. You know, he's just taking it in. He's a very humble individual. And then he has one of the biggest funeral parades in New York City history, with a very nice mausoleum on East River Drive. So remember, it's a mausoleum. So if next time somebody asks you who's buried in Grant's tomb, the answer is nobody, because he's above ground. Okay, so he's not buried there. So Grant's one that I can think of. Lee might be another one. I mean, Lee is slowly being reevaluated for some of his decisions on the field. And depending on who you talk to, Lee is not necessarily this great general. Years ago in the old Cyclorama building, we had
The chasm gets
we had a speaker series like this, and I forget who the speaker was, but he came on and he was going to give a talk on the 3 greatest generals in American history. And he prefaced it by saying one of them was not Robert E. Lee. And his 3 greatest American generals were George Washington, Dwight Eisenhower, and Grant. And every question you got after that was, why didn't you include Lee in the mix? I think Lee needs some rehabilitation as well.
Yeah.
Well, we want to thank you all for sticking around for this conversation. Hope to see you all next week, and take care in the intervening time. Thank you again.
Thank you.